All right, so now we're beginning I believe it's our last lecture on using this particular text in the Geisler and Brooks textbook here. Now, what we're doing is we're doing another just crash course in more fallacious thinking. That is to say, informal type fallacies, as opposed to the strict rules or formal fallacies of logic. We're looking again just at mistakes in reasoning in the thinking process itself. And here we have, it's titled, the chapter's titled Fallacies in Scientific Thinking. Which could be even made more general. It's just as, it could be fallacies in regards to just inductive type reasoning when you're looking at cause and effect relationships. And essentially what the authors do here is they just look at, in the context of cause and effect relationships, which is induction to a large degree, or at least it is included within induction. And they toss the scientific discipline or scientific methodology in there and label this as fallacies in scientific thinking, which it could obviously possibly be, but it could even be more generalized there to just any sort of type of inductive type reasoning. And all these, again, if you recall a chapter or two back when we talked about Mill's methods, a method that was just established or created to help to try to discern true cause and effect relationships, or perhaps we should say to whittle down probabilistically true cause and effect relationships. This is essentially just that from another angle, essentially just the negative way you could mess up, as it were, those that Mill's method, those steps to trying to find true causal relationships there. These are just some of the mistakes or missteps that could be taken. So the first is probably the most popular. That's just the post hoc fallacy. Of course, the full name for that is post hoc ergo propter hoc. And it just means that, well, after this, therefore, because of this. David Hume's famous example is of the post hoc fallacy is something like this. Every time the rooster crows, the sun comes up. Therefore, every time the rooster crows, that must be the cause of the sun coming up. Well, of course, that's just obviously not true. Just because the rooster crows and then the sun comes up, it doesn't mean by any shape, form, or fashion that the rooster crowing is what causes the sun to come up. That's obviously fallacious. Hence, post hoc ergo propter hoc. After this, therefore, because of this. Again, if you recall Mill's methods that we went through previously, just that methodology, those steps, this would just be, I think the authors even say here, it's just that some sort of common antecedent factor that's constantly, or at least almost always in the equation is you're looking at that as if that's the cause, instead of looking at all the variables that come into play in regards to what the cause and effect relationship may be. And that's going to be the case in all of these fallacies. You're only looking at one particular thing or just a few particular things, as opposed to all of the variables in regard to the cause and effect relationship there. Again, read this, digest this. They go into more detail and as far as examples go, maybe cash it out a little more. But these, again, they're not hard to understand by any stretch of the word. You just simply read the explanations and you'll get them. Again, this lecture is just more of a highlight of your reading that you've already completed or will complete. So fallacy of emphasizing irrelevant factors. That sounds pretty self-explanatory and obviously sounds related to the first fallacy. And so it just assumes that a common antecedent factor is the relevant factor, when obviously it's not, which is, again, it sounds just like, or at least very similar to the post hoc fallacy. Keep going, fallacy of neglecting negative evidence. This is just the type of fallacy when you're just ignoring the evidence that is contrary to your position. You're just constantly ignoring that, constantly shoving it under the table. This is a lot of times where bias really comes into play, or wishful thinking, that sort of thing. When you really have one particular conclusion that you want to get to, but you consistently ignore, you're going to push down the evidence that may be against that. And again, you just simply read the examples here, and it's very easily understood by doing so. In fact, just one of their example series that talks about some sort of televangelist that talks about how television corrupts morals, or virtue. Yet he ignores, say, someone like me who grew up watching, Looney Tunes, where every other episode Bugs Bunny's smashing somebody over the head with a pan or whatever, and Elmer Fudd shooting whoever, and Wile E. Coyote's constantly trying to destroy the Roadrunner, or the Three Stooges, where there's just constantly some sort of violent reaction going on, who don't turn out necessarily violent. So again, it's just saying that you're ignoring relevant data that may be counter to what your conclusion is. Obviously, related to that is the next fallacy of neglecting differences. Just read through that. That's just saying, I really do like this example that they give in the second paragraph regarding the King James Version of the Bible. A lot of fundamentalists or uber type conservative believers would argue that any other version than the King James Version is liberal, quote unquote, because it seems to take out verses or reword verses, rephrase particular verses that pay high honor to, say, the blood of Christ or to the divinity of Jesus, the deity of Christ, yet completely ignore areas in which the quote unquote liberal versions teach or preach or extort the exact same things, just not in those particular verses that they're looking at. So again, just look through that. That's a very good example of that fallacy. Now, the next would be fallacy of reversing cause and effect. Pretty self-explanatory. Obviously, it has to be the cause that produces the effect, not the effect that produces the cause. Now, what I really want to look at is this reciprocal causality. Their example is, again, take the relationship between violence on television and violent crime. Which is the actual cause and which is the actual effect? Or is there some sort of circular effect going on there, some sort of reciprocal type effect? Is it that, people that watch television violence become more violent themselves, which makes more real violence? Or is it that people that watch, or the people that are violent, that commit violence, are more prone to watch television violence, which in turn helps them to be more violent or triggers them more, so to speak, to be more violent? What if there's some sort of reciprocal cause and effect relationship there? That's something that has to be taken note of. Now, the next is fallacy of confusing cause and condition. And so just to reiterate what they say here, just essentially to quote what they say, it's just one error that we might fall into is not understanding what we really mean by a cause. So they say there's a big difference between the things needed to set up an effect and making the effect happen. You can see the stage for a play, you can set the stage for a play, but until the actors arrive and the curtain goes up, the play doesn't happen. So you can finish that out there. It's just to say that a condition is necessary for the effect to occur. However, essentially it's when you confuse necessary and sufficient conditions. So if you understand that concept about a condition that's necessary but not necessarily sufficient, people confuse that in regards to the cause and effect relationship. But again, just read through there. That's once they explain that really hammers home what they're talking about there. And what I really want to key in on here, which I think is the most important, especially in regards to the Thomistic and classical realist view of philosophy, is the types of causes to begin with. So Gosselin and Brooks, they list here more than 4. They actually list 5 or 6 causes. So they say the efficient, the final, the formal, the material, the exemplar, and the instrumental. Now, for our purposes, I'd rather just go ahead and key on the 4 causes that Aristotle most keyed on, and Aquinas would most key on, which is just the final cause, the formal cause, the efficient cause, and the material cause. Meaning to say this, that we are so indoctrinated and influenced by a naturalistic view of the world, and a naturalistic kind of philosophy has so pervaded our thinking that usually when we think of cause and effect relationships, we think primarily and solely of the efficient cause of say, an event. Now, Aristotle and Aquinas would seriously challenge that notion, and I think they're right. In fact, if you hold to Thomistic philosophy, you think that they're correct. And I think that once you think deeply upon the subject, I think that you believe that they're correct. And so what they would say is anything that comes to exist, and I'm overgeneralizing to an extent here, speaking roughly, but for anything that comes to exist, anything that's contingent, anything that depends on something else for its existence, imagine, say, a street sign, then if I were to say what caused that sign, most people would say, well, obviously the person that put it up or the people that made it or whatnot. But when you think about it, and as Aristotle and Aquinas would argue, that there's actually 4 causes for something like that sign, and 4 causes for, again, anything else that comes to be. So they would say the efficient cause of that sign is the person who is responsible for making it or whatnot. That's the efficient cause of the sign. However, the final cause of the sign is the end purpose or the goal for which the thing was made to begin with. So you have somebody that causes the sign, that is to say, brings it into being. The efficient cause, they construct it, they do whatever to bring the thing into being. Geisler and those guys here would split that a little further. They would say the efficient cause is the person, but the exemplar cause is the tools or whatever that brought it, or the instrumental cause is that through which that it came to be, say the tools or the hammer, whatever they use. But to keep it more simplistically, we can just say the efficient cause would be the person or machine or whatever brought the thing into being. But again, they would say, Aristotle, Aquinas, they would say there's a final cause to that. The whole point, the goal for which it was made, the final cause of the stop sign is to what? It's to the point of that stop sign. The end goal of making it was to convey some sort of message to stop. In fact, they would say that was the cause of all the other causes, meaning that if there wasn't a purpose to the thing to be brought about, then you never would have had an efficient cause. You never would have had an instrumental cause. You never would have had a material cause. You never would have had any cause at all if the final cause wasn't driving the others. Now, obviously, the material cause, Aristotle and Aquinas would say, is the metal or the alloy, whatever the sign is made of, plastic or a combination thereof. Whatever the sign is made of is the material cause of the sign. The formal cause would be, and this is the most difficult to understand, this would be the nature or the essence or the whatness of the sign. And sometimes this is a little more difficult to understand when we talk about things made by people. It'd be easier to understand something about if we were talking about natural things, like say a dog or whatnot. So let's just swap over very quickly to our examples, talk about a dog. The final cause would be whatever the goal or end purpose that dogs do, whatever it is, their goal or the goal or purpose that they serve. That would be the final cause of the dog, or even the things within the dog, even literally the molecular structure, the atoms, the collocation of chemical combinations, however that works, whatever the telos of those things are, that would be the final cause. The efficient cause of the dog would be something like its parents, the mother and the father, the biological mother and the father of the dog, bringing it into existence. In that sense, the material cause would be that from which the dog is made of, the specific material that it's composed of. And the formal cause, for our purposes here, while we swapped over our example, the formal cause would be dogness itself. The formal cause of the dog would be dogness, meaning that aside from the other causes, if there was no formal cause, where there's no explanation as to why this material is not something else other than a dog. So the dogness, the nature, the essence of the dog itself is its formal cause. And I know that may sound, if you're not familiar with, say, an Aristotelian Thomistic type metaphysic, then that may sound very foreign to you. But the more you read about that, the more you digest, the more sense that actually makes. In fact, AT philosopher, Aristotelian Thomistic philosopher Ed Feser argues that you can't even make sense of efficient and material causes unless you have formal and final causes there. So having said that, we'll go ahead and move on after spending a little bit of time on that. Well, in fact, that's the end of that. All we have left is the exercises for chapter 10. I don't think that you'll have any problems with those. And if you've made it this far, then obviously you've completed this logic text, this intro to logic text. It's called Let Us Reason by Geisler and Brooks. And next week we'll move into, or swap over and look at, again, some of the more philosophical concepts behind Aristotelian Thomistic type logic. Now, having said that, I want to congratulate you. You should have a pretty decent grasp on logic at this point. Formal fallacies, informal fallacies, how to construct a syllogism. Hopefully this will really benefit you, whether you are at work or even in school in some other institution, or even on social media when you're trying to make the case for a position that we hold to. That you'll have a grasp of logic, how to put that in syllogistic form, how to hold people, so to speak, hold them to the iron if they're challenging one of your premises, to be able to back up one of your specific premises that help get you to your conclusion. Hopefully, again, as well, you'll be able to point out their mistakes, whether they are committing some sort of formal fallacy in an argument, or, and more likely, you can point out informal fallacies. If someone's arguing and using something that requires or brings into focus the genetic fallacy or an ad hominem to be able to identify such things, just with what we've already gone through so far. So congratulations on that, and I hope that you find that beneficial. Use that in service of the kingdom and truth, obviously. See you next week.